All right. Get started here. Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the May lecture. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the president of the Horological Society of New York. And I'm very happy to see such a large crowd out here tonight on a beautiful May evening. As usual, let's get started with a few announcements before we get to the main event. So an education update. We've got a lot of things going on with HSNY education. Starting, we have our May evening classes, which are available now on the website. And we have an NYC weekend class coming up on May 11th, which is kind of an unusual thing, but we're trying to do them more often now. So if you want to take the 101 through 103 class, it will be offered on May 11th. Then we're going down to Los Angeles, also on the same weekend, hosted by FP Journe, the FP Journe Boutique in LA. And then Toronto, May 18th and the 19th, hosted by our good friend, Mo Jabber. And then we are taking a long flight all the way over to Hong Kong for a weekend of classes, June 8th and 9th, hosted by Watchbox in partnership with the Upper House. So that's really exciting. We're really looking forward to that weekend. And there's a special treat. Our Director of Traveling Education is here tonight. He's in the back row, Mr. Vincent Robert. We can say hi and give him a hand. It's a special treat because Vincent is usually flying all over the world teaching classes for us, so it's nice to see him here tonight. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the gala. Who here attended the gala? All right, we've got a big portion of the audience. So for those that did not attend, it was an incredible night, and I wanted to just recap a few things that happened on the night so that everyone can be on the same page. HSNY and the AWCI made a collaborative donation, a matching donation, $10,000 each for a $20,000 total donation to the watchmaking program at the Paris, Texas Junior College. This was really special. I wanted to just briefly mention how this came about. In 2018, the Oklahoma State School watchmaking program closed. And overnight, we lost 10% of the potential graduating watchmaking students in the country. That's a big deal. It was really not widely reported, but it's a big deal for the industry. And so earlier this year, the AWCI president, Aaron Rexek, he visited the Paris, Texas watchmaking program. And he got to see what was happening there. And he gave me a call and said that they were really in need of some new tools. And so we thought of a way that HSNY and AWCI could collaborate and work together on this, and we came together for these large donations to the school. And so it's just a really special thing that we were able to do at the gala, and I was very happy that Stanley McMahon was at the gala himself. Stanley is the instructor at the Paris, Texas school, and he was able to receive the big novelty checks. And so speaking of big novelty checks, we gave out more on the night. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, we're going to talk about the Howard Fass Award. So we also gave out the Howard Fass Award. And the Howard Fass Award is HSNY's kind of Lifetime Achievement Award. It's a big deal. It's our highest honor. And it's not something that we give out every year. And so we gave it this year to Mr. Daniel Fenwick, and he's a very famous American watchmaker, watchmaking instructor. He's really devoted his entire life to horological education. So it was really an honor to be able to present him with the Howard Fass Award on the night. And our Vice President, John Tiefert, presented it to him, and it was really another special moment. Okay, so getting to the more big checks, we gave out 3 more of these big checks, and they were given to 3 very deserving young watchmaking students from around the country. And we were lucky that all three of them were able to attend in person for the night. And you can kind of see what we're doing here. You can see the trend. Last year we gave out 2 checks. This year we gave out 3 checks. So what we're really trying to do is expand our scholarship program as much as possible every year, because we really want to make sure that anyone who's studying watchmaking in the USA can do it without worrying about paying the rents, buying food. They can really focus on their education, and that's what we're trying to do with the scholarship program. So, to close out the gala, we had a record night for our charity auction. We raised over $45,000 at the charity auction. And this is Miss Caroline Irvin from Christie's. She was calling the auction. It was plenty of enthusiastic bidders. It was really an exciting auction. So it's if you didn't get a chance to attend this year, save the date, because we already have scheduled it for next year. We're going to be having the 154th anniversary charity auction and gala on April 1st, 2020. So make sure to mark that on your calendars now. All right, so tonight's lecture. So I was kind of joking and asking some people before, by show of hands, has anybody here been to Times Square for New Year's Eve? Has anyone? Oh, we had like a few people. Oh, Charlie and Ed have been to Times Square, so they've seen the ball drop in person. And so if you know what I'm talking about. Just a couple blocks from where we are tonight, there's a big ball that drops every New Year's Eve to mark the new year in Times Square. It's kind of a big deal. But where did that come from? Where did that custom of dropping a ball come from? Tonight we're going to find out. We're going to look at its history. So our speaker for the evening has worked as a conservator at the Royal Museums Greenwich, and now she works as the curator of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers collection at the Science Museum London, which, if you have had a chance to visit, I think it's one of the best horological collections in the world at a world-class museum. So go check it out. Please join me in welcoming, all the way from London, England, Miss Anna Rolls.
Right, can everyone hear me? No? I need to be a bit closer, okay. All right, I'm going to put that there. Okay, can you hear me now? Yes. Great. Well, thank you very much, Nick, and good evening, everybody. And first of all, thank you to the Horological Society of New York for inviting me here to come and talk to you this evening. It really is an honor and a privilege to be standing up here before you all, so thank you very much. Nick, you've sort of introduced me briefly, but I was going to just give you a little quick sort of intro to myself as to who I am. I'm Anna Rolls, if you've just heard, and I am the curator of the Clockmakers Museum, which is a wonderful collection of clocks, watches, and horological ephemera that belongs to the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers. And it charts the history, in particular, of London clockmaking from around the 1600s onwards, and is based in the Science Museum in London. But before I started working there back in September last year, I worked for about 10 years as a conservator of scientific instruments in the Royal Museums Greenwich. So the Royal Museums Greenwich is a museum organisation which is based, surprisingly enough, in Greenwich, which is in the southeast of London, and it's responsible for 4 sites, which is the Cutty Sark ship, the Royal Observatory, the Queen's House, which was originally built as a palace and is now a gallery of naval art, and the National Maritime Museum. And tonight I'm going to be talking about the time ball, which is something that I got to know very well while I was employed for the organisation. And you can just see it there on the left-hand side, sitting on top of the observatory. So what is it? Well, as Nick has just said also, we know that it's a ball that drops. And in fact, it's the first ever time signal, public time signal, and it's in the form of a bright red 5-foot diameter ball. And it's designed to mark 1 o'clock every day by dropping from the top of its mast instantaneously. It's located on the eastern turret of Flamsteed House, which is the oldest building in the observatory. And it was installed on the building in 1833. It's one of the many accessioned objects within the museum, and it's a 19th century concept powered with 20th century engineering, and it's timed by 21st century computing. So it's a pretty complicated object to look after. It also sits on the observatory itself. It's integral to the building. And it requires the cooperation of various departments across the museum, as well as the knowledge and care of outside expertise to ensure that it continues to operate safely and on time every day. My knowledge and interest in the ball really developed as a result of quite an extensive amount of work from 2016 onwards, when the museum had a fair bit of trouble with it. On the 23rd of June, the ball had ground to a halt. This happens to also be a day that sticks in my mind because it was the day of the Brexit vote. No amount of oil or TLC or kicking it would get it moving again, and we managed to get it operational after a few months, but it would take around about 2 years for us to really get to the bottom of what the problem was and iron all these problems out, which I could say is unlike the Brexit vote. In the process of this whole development, I had to delve deep into the museum archives to see if I could find any problems, any answers to the problems that were there. And instead, I learned so much more. I learned about its history and its mechanics and its evolution and how it has been to keep such an iconic object in operation, both in the context of a working observatory and also as a museum attraction. And so this talk tonight is really to give you a little insight into what I learned about. The best way to describe it is really to show you it in action. And so I did a quick video of it, and I've sped it up because otherwise it would take a whole 5 minutes, which I haven't really got time in this lecture. So at 5 minutes to 1, it's hoisted halfway up the mast as a preparatory signal. And the idea is that it's designed to tell everybody that the ball is about to drop at 1 o'clock. And then at 2 minutes to 1, it's hoisted all the way to the top of the mast, ready to do its thing. It's quite slow. And then at 1 o'clock, precisely, it drops. And it drops a lot, and the difference between the time ball at Times Square and this particular ball is that the instantaneous moment that it drops is the moment that 1 o'clock hits, unlike the Times Square ball, which takes a whole minute to drop down, and I think it's at the end that it marks the hour. So, why a time signal on Flamsteed House? Well, the building was founded in 1675 by Charles II and was completed a year later. And it was designed by Christopher Wren and named after the first astronomical observator, or what we now refer to as the Astronomer Royal, John Flamsteed. And it was built for the purposes of rectifying the tables of the motions of the heavens and the places of the fixed stars, so as to find out the so much desired longitude of places for perfecting the art of navigation. Or in other words, carrying out observations of the positions of the sun, the moon, the stars, and planets, in order to compile accurate star charts and maps for use in finding longitude. But I'm not here to talk about the history of the observatory, so we're going to fast forward 150 or so years. The longitude problem has been solved thanks to the development of the marine chronometer, and the lunar distance method is also a viable means for finding longitude thanks to the work carried out in observatories like Greenwich. And the observatory and time are inextricably linked. A star would transit over a north-south meridian at the same sidereal or star time every day, just like the number on a watch dial passes under the hand at the same time every day. And these star transits could be used to determine and then set time very accurately. And mariners required accurate time in order to obtain a rate for their chronometers. And when they were docked, as in this picture just here, in the vicinity of somewhere like Greenwich, they could go and receive a rate from Greenwich. By the 1820s, a captain in the Royal Navy by the name of Robert Walcott felt that mariners would have a far better and improved service if they didn't have to go off the ship and somehow bring time back to the ship. If they could actually have a means of seeing a time signal whilst on board, there would be a much improvement to their rating. And so his idea was to drop a ball from the top of a mast. And this was trialled in the naval dockyard of Portsmouth on the south coast of England in 1829. And only 4 years later, in 1833, a ball was installed on the eastern turret of Flamsteed House. It was designed to drop at 1 o'clock, and people often ask, why not midday? It seems like a more logical time to drop a ball. Well, at noon, astronomers would be using our very own star, the sun, which would be transiting over the meridian. And so they would be doing the necessary calculations to set the observatory clock so that the subsequent hour would be the most accurate time to then produce a time signal. No longer is it used today as a time service by ships, as far as I'm aware anyway, on the Thames, in the adjacent reaches, or in the nearby docks that overlook. But it does still drop precisely at 1 o'clock every day, and it now draws an expectant crowd of visitors who are waiting for a little bit of history to repeat itself. What you see in the image here isn't actually the original ball. This one was built and installed in 1919 by the Clockmakers Edward Dent and Company. The original 1833 ball and mechanism was constructed by Maudsley, Sons and Field, who were a company who specialised in the manufacture of steam engines, and at that time the only Thames-based naval engine firm to fulfil naval contracts, and possibly the reason why they were chosen to build the ball. The ball and its lifting mechanism were fabricated in around 3 to 4 months and at a cost of about £180, which I think is very fast and quite cheap. The previous ball and mast, which you can just make out in the left-hand postcard, was also 5 foot in diameter. This time it was reportedly made from a wooden frame with a wood veneer bent over the top and then canvas and stretched and then painted. Incidentally, was painted black. The time ball today is actually red, but the original was black. And there was a lot of public interest in the ball. There are a number of publications written on it in the decades following its installation, and because of these publications, we now know how it originally operated. And I'm going to use a description and images, which is the one on the right-hand side, from the Illustrated London News of 1844 to try and explain its mechanism to you. It spanned 3 floors internally. It's a really big bit of equipment, and then it comes out through this eastern turret and then out into the open, so that top bit is the only bit like an iceberg in a way. You only just see the very top of it. And in the middle, you can see an assistant who's positioned next to a winch. And on the winch is a chain. And this chain passes up and over a pulley and down onto a weighted collar. And the collar supports a piece of wood, a wooden post. And if you can see in the illustration on the right-hand side, it's marked A. And this post... Oh, I've gone too far. I do apologise. No, there we are. I haven't gone too far. That is the weighted collar there. And the post can move freely up and down inside a channel within the mast. And the ball is attached to the top of the post, and it can travel freely over the top of the mast. At the other end of the wooden post was attached an iron rod, and this iron rod extended down and had a piston at the bottom of it, and this piston inserted inside a cylinder, which you can just see there. So when the crank was turned, the ball, which was attached to the post, was lifted up by the collar. And the collar was guided by two rods that kept everything in position. Once the ball was halfway up the mast for its 5 minutes to preparatory signal, the winch was then locked by a detent, and the whole thing was kept in position. And then at 2 minutes to 1, the ball was winched to the top. And then once it had reached the top, the piston now passed over some latches, or what are sometimes referred to as clips in the historic documents. And these latches lock onto the piston and essentially lock the ball into position. And this meant that the operator could now reverse the winch and bring the whole lifting mechanism back down to the beginning. And at 1 o'clock, a trigger was pulled by another assistant, positioned at the very bottom, and this released the latches and allowed the ball to instantaneously drop. The piston's job, not only to hold the whole thing in position, was also to act as a brake, so that the piston fell inside the cylinder and compressed the air inside the cylinder and basically slowed the fall of the ball, because otherwise there was a very good chance that the ball was going to crash into the top of the roof. And the trigger was pulled by an assistant who was positioned next to a regulator. And he needed, as Charles Dickens put it in 1850, a practiced hand upon a trigger and a practiced eye upon the face of a dial. That dial belonged to George Graham's number 3 regulator, which you can just see here. This was originally built as a sidereal transit clock in 1750, and then it was converted at a later point to show solar time and moved adjacent to the trigger for use with the time ball. So it had a really good long career, this clock. So far I've talked about a time service which in principle was designed for navigators, but as the 19th century progressed, a centralised national time standard became a greater necessity, with the introduction of the railways in 1825 and other communication methods such as the telegraph in 1843. The 7th Astronomer Royal, George Biddell Airy, and his work with galvanism, or what we refer to now as electricity, lay at the heart of achieving this. In 1852, he commissioned a chronometer maker, Charles Shepherd, to build a master clock, and this would give out electrical impulses to slave clocks around the observatory, including a large new public dial clock on the exterior wall of the observatory, which we now call the Shepherd Gate clock. And you can see the public dial on the left-hand side and the master clock on the right-hand side. At the same time, telegraph, postal, railway companies were also able to receive a regular time signal, which was sent out from the master clock via the telegraph network, which telegraph cables extended from the observatory down to the local railway lines and then onwards through the railway network. And the time ball too benefited from this new and improved service, with the new master clock now able to provide a signal to release it. So our assistant with his practiced eye and practiced finger were sadly made redundant. Now, at 1 o'clock, this impulse triggered a solenoid to fire, which actuated the detent, which then released the latches. This transition also marked a new era for the use of time balls, time guns, and other time signals nationwide, which were now able to receive this accurate signal from Greenwich. But did it also mark the beginning of more regular drop failures? Questions I have are, well, how often did this signal failure? Now we've automated a bit of it, is it more prone to actually going wrong? It's certainly apparent that the Admiralty had adopted the rule that if a time ball didn't drop on the hour precisely, it would be kept at the top of the masthead for 10 minutes, then lowered down gradually, and then brought back up to the top of the mast and released by hand on the subsequent hour. Thanks to better record keeping after 1871, we now know that the ball didn't drop on a handful of occasions due to what they refer to as accidental failure, although the cause was never actually mentioned as to why it had failed. After 1874, greater detail was given for the cause, ranging from mechanical issues such as those associated with the clock, or failure of the latches. This was a really frequent problem with the latches releasing and not keeping the ball up when it should have been. And then there were electrical issues, such as the direction of current through the magnet or general signal failure. We know that repairs to the machinery were carried out in 1884 and 1895, with the latter requiring 2 months of downtime. And some of the problems noted were a broken chain, a rotten upper section of the ball, and a rusty cylinder interior. And the turn of the century saw repeated failures as a result of electrical connections, as well as failures of the time signal itself. So we've had a rotten ball, recurring failures of the clips to hold the ball, and we also have a rotten mast, which I haven't touched upon yet, but I'll come on to in a bit. Perhaps it was concluded that the design was flawed or unsafe, but for whatever reason, in June 1914, the green light was given for, and I quote, "the renewal of the time ball and general overhaul and reconstruction of its mechanism." 1914, the timing was unfortunate. This was also the start of the First World War, and as a result, the project was delayed. And it wasn't until April 1919 that the works finally began. And these included strengthening of the ball turret, with new struts built to support the mast. The ball was fitted in June, and the winch was repositioned on the floor below. Additional counterweights were installed in the turret to relieve the weight of the ball on the latches when it was at the top of the mast. And again, I imagine this was something to do with the fact that it kept getting problems with the latches releasing early. And the ball finally commenced use in August of that year. So let's take a closer look at the changes to the design. The mast was now constructed out of a single piece of wood, and this time it was teak. Before, the old mast was actually made of softwood. As a result, the ball, which is now made of aluminium, had to be redesigned. It was now attached to and lifted by 2 metal rods which straddled the mast, and you can just see them, one of the rods coming down just there, and it's attached at the bottom of the ball. And these 2 rods came down and were attached at the bottom by a metal plate, which you can just see here, and the 2 rods are coming up from there. And projecting down from this plate, connected via a rod, was the piston, pretty much in the same manner of the old system. And this piston, once again, ran inside the cylinder, which stayed... you can just see the top of the cylinder just there. And this is essentially the same as the old system. This time, the ball and the rods were lifted by the plate, which you can just see here. So this is what we now refer to as the lifting plate. And that lifting plate, which is just here, was attached by 2 lines which connected via a yoke to a singular line, which then ran down to the winch. So basically, as the winch was turned, the lifting plate pulled the plate and thus the rods, and thus pushed the ball all up into the air. And this is it in its 5 minutes to 1 position, where the winch will once again have been locked to keep it in position. And then it gets to the top, and this time the latches don't actually clip onto the piston itself, they're now engaging with a plate just above the piston. And again, I think this is because they had so many problems with the piston that they sort of redesigned the latches to engage at a different point. And so now the lifting gear can be brought back down. And so 1 o'clock comes, it gets its impulse, and the ball drops. Not quite that fast. It's fair to say that this new and improved design only saw probably a couple of decades of use as a precision time signal. By December 1927, the Royal Observatory was able to broadcast its time signal by radio from Rugby in Warwickshire in the centre of England. And although the ball did continue to operate, I suspect more for a continuity of service for those who hadn't adopted the new technology, astronomers were also having issues with the ability to observe due to light pollution and smog in London. And by 1940, there were also issues with the advent of the Second World War, and frequent air raids were making it almost impossible to observe at night time. And so the entire time service was moved outside of London to Abinger, which is in Surrey, just outside of London. In September of the following year, the observatory annual reports stated that the time ball had ceased to be of importance. And after that, the annual reports made no more mention of the ball. After the war, between 1947 and 58, the remainder of the observatory was moved down to Herstmonceux on the Sussex coast. So was the ball ever in use after 1941? It's hard to know. But we do know that it was brought into use for the Festival of Britain in 1951. And the festival, which was held on the south bank of the Thames, was designed to mark 100 years since the Great Exhibition. And it was a national celebration of science and engineering and technology, but also to promote a feeling of recovery after the devastation of war. We know that the ball in Greenwich was operating for this period, but we also know that a replica was placed inside the festival's Dome of Discovery. And this is an illustration from a guidebook map, and you can see the time ball just at the top of the outer space section. And I think it's really great that the time ball was deemed important enough to be included into this national celebration. So in the early 1950s, discussions and plans were talked through to turn the observatory into an annex of the National Maritime Museum, which incidentally is just underneath the observatory at the bottom of the hill. And so it was that the future of the observatory as a museum of astronomy and navigation was confirmed by the First Lord of the Admiralty in the Houses of Parliament on the 11th of March in 1953. Flamsteed House passed into the hands of the National Maritime Museum with responsibility for the fabric of the building under the governmental Ministry of Works. At first, only one part of Flamsteed House, which is now known as the Octagon Room, was opened in May 1953. And you can just see the Octagon Room as it is today in this slide. And it's been recreated to look like the interior from 1675. And you can also see there's 3 dials in the centre, and they are where the Thomas Tompions that were commissioned by John Flamsteed would have sat. And incidentally, the time ball mechanism spans the entire room, just behind these clocks and the paintings. So the cylinder is just behind the dials, and then the lifting mechanism and the rods span all the way up past up the paintings. So the remainder of the building was not opened to the public because it was still set up as apartments. And the ball was operating throughout this period, but according to museum correspondence in 1957 and 58, they suggested that there were many problems with it, including the automatic release. And just a year later, in 1958, the whole apparatus, everything, the ball, the mast, all of its mechanism was in the process of being removed. The plan was to convert the building back to the original Wren structure, like the Octagon Room, but the rest of the building was going to follow suit of the structure of 1675. But they were going to leave the time ball as a working piece of equipment in its position on the eastern turret. So all the changes that had happened to the building in its lifespan as a working observatory, whether they were architectural additions, you can see there's chimneys, ladders, all the additional domes, or the meteorological equipment that was on the top of the roof, all of this was seen to be not necessary in the sort of interpretation of the building. So it was all wiped away to leave a building of Flamsteed's era, but they kept the 20th century replacement of a 19th century time ball perched on top. So why did they completely remove it in the 1950s? Well, the initial plan had been to convert the building shortly after the opening of the Octagon Room, but the ministry was evidently strapped for cash, and the works kept getting deferred. By the end of 1957, they found that the turret had a severe outbreak of dry rot. The building required a major structural overhaul, and during this time, that the time ball and its mechanism was dismantled and completely removed from Flamsteed House. The archives don't really hold any more clues as to what work was carried out in this time, but by 1960, it's clear that the whole operation had now been entirely automated, so that not just the dropping of the ball, but the lifting of the ball was going to be done automatically. And this included a new motorized winching system, which was moved closer to the lifting gear. So you can see the motor on the bottom left-hand corner. And then the other new addition was what we'd call the safety carriage, which is at the top left-hand corner. You can see essentially is a set of springs. And the idea is that any extra tension that's put on the ball or mechanism while it's in operation would compress these springs and trigger a safety switch, which would then cut the system. And the idea was that, because there wasn't a human who could have a feel and control of what was going on, the motor would sort of just barge through all of it. So they needed to have some way of cutting it out in the event of any problem with it. The other big change that happened after this restoration was the appearance of the ball. You can see that it looks really very dented, but it's not meant to look like that. This is a newspaper cutting from the 1930s, and it shows it to be very smooth. And the story goes that one of the museum staff caught workmen rolling it roughly around the courtyard, rather like a football. What I find really strange about this is that I went through the archives and I found absolutely no mention of it between the correspondence of the director and the Ministry of Works. I really would have thought someone would have been held accountable for this, but apparently not. The system was now controlled by a synchronome pendulum clock. And this sent out signals to a set of 3 primary relays via a sequencing mechanism for each stage of the time ball's descent. This mechanism triggered each relay at particular time periods for each, at the stages of the ball, and then in turn controlled a series of secondary relays and switches that were positioned all around the mechanism to turn it on and off for each stage of the operation. For the next 20 years or so, the care and maintenance of the clock and the primary relays lay with the museum, whilst the ball and its mechanism and the secondary relays lay with the Ministry of Works, which subsequently became the Department for the Environment. Little information exists in the ministry or what I'm going to call the DOE's archives for the ball's upkeep in its early life within the museum. But clearly there were problems with reliability, as the mechanism and its control system received a fairly major overhaul in 1983. But after its first solo run, there was apparently a catastrophic failure. And according to an internal memo, not only did it fail, but it overshot the stop, the first fail-safe device, and the second fail-safe device, causing an ear-shattering row from the Octagon Room caused by the electric motor continuing to rotate a sprocket wheel in a jammed-up chain. Not good. So this accident highlighted concerns within the museum about leaving the responsibility of maintenance and repair in the hands of the Department of the Environment. As a result, the responsibility of the system was entirely handed over to the museum in May of that year. From that point on, it was the horology department who were then able to work really closely with a variety of people to build up relationships, to increase and share the knowledge of the ball and its associated parts. And over the last 30 years, there have been a few more changes, this time mostly to the timing control. Bearing in mind that the ball is now a catalogued museum item, and this means that any change needs careful thought about its preservation, even though you could technically say that much of the system is not really original. The synchrotron was eventually retired in 1991, and it too was accessioned as a museum object. And this process really needed careful thought. Should every subsequent controller or redundant piece of machinery be treated as part of the object, and thus be accessioned and cared for using the same guidelines that you might for any other museum object? And this question would become far more relevant as electronic components proved to have a shorter lifespan than some of their previous sort of mechanical versions. So, for example, the synchrotron was replaced by a quartz system which received the MSF radio time signal, and this only saw 6 years of use before it was completely blown up by a lightning strike. Its replacement also was constantly having issues with erratic timekeeping, and it too didn't really stand the test of time. In the end, a controller was fabricated internally by the tech team who were responsible for the museum's interactive displays. And this system did manage to last the test of time. It was a system that was corrected by an MSF receiver, and it was only upgraded in 2017. Problems have always irked the system, and it's generally weather that's the most usual culprit for when things go wrong. As well as in 1997, there was also a huge lightning strike which took out the system in 2011, and this caused major problems. The mechanism's location in the turret, or part of, it's in the turret, but then it extends down, and it's in an old building, and it just generally doesn't do well around moisture and temperature fluctuations. And we were often having problems with both the mechanics and the electrics. Even in 2016, when we had the problem of the ball just not playing ball, we even wondered whether it was a huge deluge of rain that had happened in the month before that might have been the reason why it wasn't working on that particular occasion. But it was the main reason for the ball not operating was the wind. Since 1855, the observatory's policy had been to not raise the ball in the event of strong wind, and this is for good reason. On December the 6th, 1855, disaster had struck. The ball, its mast, and the weather vane on top had all blown down during a storm. And this watercolour by the Astronomer Royal George Biddle Airy's son, Hubert, shows the evident damage. And as I've said, the original mast was actually made of softwood. It was also made in sectional pieces. The whole design with having a singular piece of wood that slides inside the mast is really a recipe for disaster, because water can ingress inside the mast, drip down, and sit in softwood, causing rot. And, it's not particularly surprising that eventually the whole thing did do that. We don't know what modifications were made to the ball, but it is clear that thanks to the Astronomer Royal's reports that on days of high wind, the ball was not dropped. And I presume that it was a major factor in the decision to make the 1919 upgrade out of teak, which is a much stronger and far superior wood. But even after this upgrade, the policy to not drop the ball carried on, and it still carries on today. This is more to do with not worrying about the mast blowing over, but concerns about damage that may actually occur to the mechanism itself. Strain on the winching mechanism or damage to the lifting rods themselves, which aren't particularly big compared to the rest of the ball. And until recently, it was the job of the horology staff to read the forecast, look at the boughs of the trees, make that decision as to whether it was too windy or not. This is fine when they were in, but inevitably that they might have to go and attend a meeting or a conference, or they might have visitors coming over lunchtime, or dare I say it, they might have even gone home for the weekend. And so in 2005, the decision was made to install an anemometer system. And this was going to allow the ball to shut off in the event of high winds. And the plan was to place it on the roof of Flamsteed House. After its installation, there were initial issues. The mast, as you can see here, it doesn't have the anemometer on the top. This is just the mast that we've kept for record's sake. It was a freestanding tripod, and it, unfortunately, had the tendency of getting blown over in strong winds. It also proved not to be tall enough. At this height, there was a tendency for the wind to produce eddies around the turrets, and this would give unreliable readings. And what we really didn't want was the ball to end up turning off unnecessarily. And so it was proposed that a mast would be installed that was 5 meters high, which would be much closer to the height of where the ball was positioned on top of the roof. And this postcard shows, and as we've seen from previous images, that the roof was a fitting place to put an anemometer system. There was a historic precedence for apparatus on the roof, and at the height of 5 meters, we would get reliable wind readings for the ball. But it would take, unfortunately, due to many different reasons, it took about 7 years for this project to finally get completed. And due to this lengthy time, it nearly failed to get off the ground. The length of the project had meant that many of the staff originally consulted to agree its location on the top of the roof had subsequently left museum employment. And the building is a Grade 1 listed scheduled ancient monument. And so questions were naturally being re-asked by the new people. Is it actually okay to install a 5-meter pole on top of such an iconic building? The fact that there was a historic precedence for such instrumentation was irrelevant. Flamsteed House was designated a scheduled ancient monument in 1973, and this meant that no subsequent alterations could be made to its appearance. A detailed document had to then be submitted to Historic England, who were the governing body for scheduled ancient monuments, outlining the historical precedents for such an instrument and the improvements to safety. But finally, the green light was given and the anemometer was installed. And the great news was that it did stop the ball from operating in the event of high winds. But this whole project highlights one of the issues of looking after a complex object within a museum environment, and that's effective communication. There are many different departments within the museum, all with different interests in the ball. There's the estates department, who look after the fabric of the building. The visitor services department, who engage the public's interest in it. Conservation and curatorial, who look after it and keep the records for it. Now, they all do work closely together in order to maintain best practice, and there's an interdepartmental group that meets quarterly to discuss upcoming plans and issues that relate to the ball and other parts of the observatory. This has allowed a much more efficient use of time and resources when works are carried out. As an example, in 2016, the scaffolding that was required to service the ball was then extended over to the camera obscura, which is this building just here. The camera obscura has a panning mechanism in it, and this had lain out of action for quite a long time because of access issues. The mechanism itself is just in this little turret up here and almost impossible to get to without scaffolding. And so this meant economical savings for the museum, but also a better experience for the visitors whose visit to the observatory was less disrupted by noisy and unsightly works. But of course, any time the ball was out of action would inevitably lead to disappointment for some visitors who'd come especially to witness the ball dropping. At the other end of the spectrum, there were many whose trip to the observatory was the very first time that they'd ever heard about the ball and learnt about its operation. To aid the interpretation of it these days, just before the event, there's a brief announcement that explains what it does and why it does it and the historical significance of it. But it doesn't always please everybody, and I had to include this comment because it makes me chuckle every time I read it. And I quote, "What an anticlimax. As soon as the ball rather hesitantly and stutteringly fell, everybody laughed, and there were comments along the lines of, 'What a letdown. Surely, in the 21st century, this spectacle can be jazzed up a little. Why not add some bells or bangs or lights just to make this event more impressive?'" Over the years, there have been the odd occasions when the ball has been dropped outside of its scheduled 1 o'clock drop. Not thanks to any fault, but instead intentionally. For the year 2000 millennium drop, the US Naval Observatory organised a round-the-world time ball drop. And this, of course, involved Greenwich. And the Curator of Horology, Jonathan Betts, duly scooted up into the cupboard at midnight to drop the ball. Sadly, I couldn't find any media to sort of illustrate this point, but Jonathan told me that it did absolutely happen on the night. The other event that got a far greater media coverage was the start of National Science Week a year later in 2001. The broadcaster Peter Snow was tasked with dropping the ball at 11 in the morning to mark not only the beginning of National Science Week, but also Comic Relief's Red Nose Day. And I'm not sure if you have this in America, but it's a big thing in England where people work for charity and wear a big red nose on their nose and do, crazy, stupid things to earn money for charity. And the Comic Relief, the organisers, had hoped that they might be able to drop the ball every hour of that day. But unfortunately, it was felt that it might have a dumbing down effect on the historical significance of the ball. So a compromise was found in the form of doing it one extra time at 11 in the morning. The press made a big thing about this. And there were lots of headlines saying this is the first time since 1833 that a ball had been dropped twice in one day. Clearly, this isn't true. Leaving aside the fact that the ball was dropped on the subsequent hour in the event of any failure, the annual reports, interestingly enough, show that between 1937 and 1940, which is long before the ball passed into the hands of a museum, it was dropped on the 11th hour of the 11th of November to mark Remembrance Day. And so to wrap up the talk, I thought I'd speak a little bit about my own encounters with the ball in 2016. What was the initial problem? The ball would get as far as halfway up the mast for its preparatory signal, and then it would entirely cut out. Initial inspections established that it was the safety carriage and its limit switches that were being activated, which meant that something was causing too much tension on the system and compressing the springs. But what was the problem? A thorough inspection of the mechanism did not identify anything which might be causing the problem. So it was natural to next turn to the ball itself and see if this was the cause of the issues. Of course, this wasn't an easy thing to access, and by now the museum had enlisted the help of the turret clock specialist, the Cumbria Clock Company, who were far more used to dealing with things in awkward spaces, although I have to say their testing methodology was quite simple. Hit it with a stick. Two things were apparent. The ball was out of alignment, and there was definite scrape marks in the paint on the mast. But as the mast was teak, why had it been painted anyway? The problem was we really couldn't get up to the ball and find these answers out without putting up scaffolding. And so it was decided that this was the case, that we were going to have to do this. Besides which, the fact that the ball had been found to be out of alignment, the only way we could deal with the problem was to adjust it at the nuts just there that would actually level out the ball. And so scaffolding was put up, and so the ball was then adjusted in its alignment, and it was agreed that paint was going to be removed from the contacting surfaces of the mast. At the same time, the mechanics were given a thorough overhaul, including the adjustments of any limit switches, replacement of lines and bushing of pulleys. And it was also found that the springs on the safety carriage had actually got permanent sets, so they were not, they needed to have more springiness, so an extra pair of springs were added to the top of them. The ball was eventually back on its feet, but after a few weeks it intermittently began to fail again. Next, we turned to the timing control. It was agreed that the old system, although not necessarily the cause of the failure, it wasn't in the best state. As you can see on the left, it was absolutely covered in dust, and we just thought that it might benefit from an upgrade to future-proof it. The Cumbria Clock Company designed an upgrade for the system, and this meant poring over old wiring diagrams, which took much time to decipher due to the various alterations that had happened over the years, which had not always been documented. A programmable logic controller-based system using a GPS as a time signal was installed. Redundant electrical wiring was removed, and other wiring and safety switches were replaced. After a few teething issues, the new system worked well, until it started to fail again. It was probably at this point that I started to bang my head against the wall. What were we not seeing? Every time the system was tested, it worked perfectly. And then as soon as one's back was turned, it would fail. And the issue with this is the ball only operates once a day. And so to see it doing it, working in its natural setting meant patiently every day waiting at 1 o'clock, observing it, trying to be looking at every single last thing at the same time, hoping that whatever was causing the problem might identify itself. And what usually happened is it worked perfectly Monday to Friday when I was in, and then at the weekend it would fail. The issue, the great news was we eventually witnessed the problem. It just so happened that on one of the sessions when we were testing it out, it did its thing, which was so good. And it turned out it was actually the magnetic brake on the winch that was not always releasing. And I'm not going to go into the detail of how this would then cause a failure of the system, but the long and short of it was that by the time anyone actually got to, because we weren't always at the mechanism waiting for it to happen. So if it failed, someone would run over and try and see what had happened. But by that time, the brake would normally have released itself, and so the problem had remained completely hidden. We then had quite a few discussions about why this was failing, but eventually it was decided that the motor and its brake would be sent away and be completely stripped down and overhauled. And did it fix the problem? I'm pleased to say that a year on, as far as I'm aware, it's been working perfectly. So, woo, we did it. And so as an afterthought, I thought I would leave you with something a question that had never properly been answered, which is how is the ball made? With scaffolding around it, my colleague Rory McAvoy and I had had the opportunity to examine inside. In 2006, previous horology staff had actually drilled a little hole in the base of the ball and stuck an endoscope in themselves to try and answer this question. But unfortunately, the light had not been quite good enough for them to draw any really solid conclusions. This time, we inserted a great big LED strip inside it and sort of gave it as much light as we could. And we did managed to see quite well inside. But unfortunately, I don't have any images, so I've drawn a little sort of diagram to show you what it looked like inside. Essentially, there was a wooden box, like a sleeve, that covered around the mast. And at the bottom of this box, it was attached to a wooden plate. And the plate was then screwed to the base of the ball. And you can just see the screws. It's not quite so easy to see, but you can actually just see the screw heads that attach this wooden plate at the base. And there's no evidence inside of any more supporting structure. So then we turned to the inside of the ball itself. And we wanted to see maybe there was some evidence of seam lines or weld marks to show how it might have been constructed in sections. And there was nothing. It was a perfectly smooth interior. Not like, it was just a nice matte grey finish. And unfortunately, we couldn't see to the very top of the ball. The endoscope wouldn't reach that high. And so we then looked to the outside, and you can just see, just at the top there's one seam line just there. That's the only mark that you can see on the ball. So we had to conclude that the only way that this could have been manufactured was that the ball was spun. And it was spun in on itself and formed into nearly into a sphere. And then the internal structure was inserted and the top bit was welded on. And I don't know if any of you have done any spinning before, but that to me is an absolutely remarkable bit of undertaking and quite a dangerous operation, because it's, you've got to remember this was 5 foot in diameter. And with that thought, I'm going to say thank you very much for listening to me, and does anyone have any questions?
All right, if anybody has any questions for Ms. Rolls, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. I'll go all the way to the back to Ed first.
Anna, thank you very much. It was very interesting, but I'm very curious. What is the diameter of the ball?
The diameter is 5 foot.
Okay,
5.
thank you.
It's yeah. Well, when you think of spinning it, it's a very big ball. Yeah. Yeah, 5 foot diameter.
Thank you. Can you give us a rough idea? How much does it weigh?
Everyone always asks this question.
And how many visitors do you get every year?
Ooh. Okay, so the weight. I can't remember when it was, but in a previous occasion, the guys who came in to do some of the servicing on it did rig up a system to try and lift up the ball. And I can't remember the exact figure, but you have to remember that to take into account the fact that you're not just lifting up the ball, it's the posts and all of the lifting mechanism. But I think they reached a figure of it was around about 120 kilos for all of that, which I don't know what that is in pounds. But yeah, so maybe 240 pounds, 250 pounds, yeah. But that's not just for the ball. I mean, obviously the ball is attached to everything else. Besides which, there are counterweights that are working against the system. But that's around about the figure that they pulled anyway. Visitors.
So, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It takes 250 pounds to make it move, or that's what you're guessing that weighs?
Well, when you consider the fact that the whole system, you've got the rods that are attached to it, and then you've got counterweights that are working against it. But when they weighed the system, that's the figure that they got. But I can't give you a figure for the ball itself. And figures, I think, this is slightly plucking it out of the air, but I think it's around, to the whole site, maybe about 3 million visitors a year, I think. But not necessarily all of those are going to through the observatory itself. But it is one of the most visited attractions within the complex of the Royal Museums, Greenwich. But I'll need to check Google on that one.
Any other questions?
was wondering that when the ball actually drops, like what's the speed of when it drops?
That's a really good question. It's free falling briefly because the air doesn't, the piston, there isn't actually a kind of air outlet before it starts to compress it. So with gravity, the speed of, yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
And I've got a question for you. Besides the Greenwich time ball and the time ball 2 blocks away in Times Square,
Yeah.
and the time ball at the U.S. Naval Observatory,
Yeah.
how many other time balls are there around the world?
Well, there's. I mean, at the heyday, there was sort of a few dozen time balls, but they're not all still in existence today, and not all of them are still working. So of the ones that are actually functioning, there's only a handful, and of course there was one in Christchurch, which was until the earthquake functioning, which isn't anymore. But yeah, not many actually in operation still today.
Any other questions? Back here.
My question is really simple. Why is Greenwich Mean Time and London Time an hour apart?
Sorry, I missed that. Why
Is Greenwich Mean Time and London Time an hour apart?
an hour apart?
Yes, it's a 4 o'clock GMT. It's 5 o'clock in London or 4 o'clock in London.
Do you mean the difference between British summertime or?
No. All the time it's an hour. If you ever fly in an airplane, the timing they give you is GMT, which is an hour different than your watch says.
I mean, the time in Greenwich would be the same if the difference between I'm not sure, but the time between summertime and Greenwich.
It's something that's very strange. I've never gotten an answer. I had a friend that had an airplane, and he always put GMT in his
and a whole I
and
I don't know.
and it was always an hour off.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I think we had one more question up here.
Has the ball ever been defaced or vandalized or attacked in any way for whatever reason?
Sorry, say that again.
Has the ball or the turret ever been defaced or vandalized or attacked
No,
in any
it's
way?
impossible to get to. You need scaffolding to get up to it. I mean, apart from the time that the ball was sort of manhandled in the 1960 renovation, no one's been up there. I mean, I wouldn't really want to climb up there myself because it's not only up a turret and then up sort of the mast is around sort of 15, 16 foot high. You've also got to climb up the building itself. And then it's on the top of a hill. So I would be impressed if anyone did get up there, but no, not only birds. They're very good at vandalizing it all the time.
One final question. As a horological bibliographer, my question is, all of the stuff you have told us, is that recorded someplace where it can be read and where it has been published, or will it be published?
Yeah, there are. I'm not the first person to have talked about the time ball. There are other people who have certainly written about the ball. Whether I'm going to publish it, no. I think there's, to be honest, there's quite a lot of sort of behind the scenes bits that I'm not sure I should be probably telling.
It will be. It will be on our website.
Well, there we go. There's your answer. But no, I mean, it's already, the ball has been extensively written about, so. Yeah.
So this publication will be on your website.
Well, there we go.
Any other questions?
GMT and London time has to do with daylight savings time.
Yeah, the BST, British Summertime, yeah.
All right, well, let's give Ms. Rolls another hand.
Cheers. Cheers. Thank you.
Let's use this one. Our next lecture is coming up in June, and it's Monday, June 3rd, with Joe Kirk from Grand Seiko, and he's going to be lecturing on the spring drive mechanism. We hope to see everyone there, and I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.